So first of all, actually, I would like to just pause and take a moment and say welcome to you all. Very glad you're all here. And I'd also like to thank Dr. O'Donnell-Tormey and Brian and the staff from CRI for their vision in helping to really pioneer this field, to help support it for many years before it became successful, when there were a lot of discouraging and difficult times, but nonetheless, fortunately, people continued to persevere, and that perseverance would not have been possible without the support of groups like the Cancer Research Institute. So I'd like to just pause and thank them here for all their work and effort. As many of you may know, there is a very important meeting that begins tomorrow morning, probably the most important meeting in our field of cancer immunotherapy, that will be bringing in...
I have 1,400 people coming.
I was going to say hundreds, if not a couple of thousand people. These are researchers, clinicians involved in developing the science of immuno-oncology and immunotherapy for patients. And this meeting will run through Wednesday, and bringing the world's experts together to talk about their research and work and progress, as well as frustrations. But having today here as the kickoff for that meeting was also, I think, a very important visionary aspect of Jill and the folks at the Cancer Research Institute. So I think this is critical. It is a very exciting time in our field. There's an awful lot going on, as you heard about this morning from our excellent speakers. In terms of brain cancer, this is a very challenging area of oncology. And we treat patients who have tumors that arise in the brain, what we refer to as primary brain cancers. And we also treat the tumors that metastasize, begin elsewhere in the body, and then spread to the brain. And fortunately, immunotherapy has been involved, or there have been significant research efforts evaluating immunotherapies for both of these challenging groups of tumors that involve the brain and the central nervous system. The tumors that arise in the brain are relatively rare compared to lung cancer and colon cancer and breast cancer, but they're very, very difficult, challenging tumors, and tumors we have struggled to improve outcome for our patients. And similarly, cancers, once they've metastasized to the brain, can be very challenging. There are many clinical trials now that have initiated and beginning to report results looking at immunotherapy treatments, the spectrum of immunotherapy treatments we heard about from Dr. Cho earlier, vaccines, checkpoint inhibitors, even these engineered T-cell therapies that are very exciting for brain cancer patients, and beginning to look at some of the combination treatments, which I agree with the prior speakers here this morning will be very critical in hopefully optimizing these treatments for our patients. We'll be reporting one of the first immunotherapy trials for glioblastoma, the most common and most challenging primary brain cancer among adults, here at this upcoming meeting on Tuesday morning, and that clinical trial was gratefully supported by CRI, and I hope is paving the way, continuing to pave the way for the evaluation of these therapies for patients with brain cancer.
Thanks very much, Jedd. So, Hearn, you kind of alluded to things happening in myeloma, but I guess I'd ask you, what do you think is the most exciting immunotherapy treatments going on right now in myeloma and other hematological malignancies?
So the blood cancers are very interesting because they're actually cancers of the immune system. And as such, they interact with immune therapies. It appears pretty clear that they interact with immune therapies in different ways than perhaps the solid tumor experience. So for example, checkpoint inhibitors alone were able to elicit good responses in solid tumors such as melanoma and colon cancer, But as single agents, as just one treatment, the checkpoint inhibitors didn't show much activity, for example, in multiple myeloma. They did show a lot of activity in Hodgkin's lymphoma. And interestingly enough, Hodgkin's lymphoma expresses very high levels of PD-L1, which is that biomarker that Dr. Wolchok was talking about. But there's two big movements, I think, in the myeloma field that are of great interest. The first is there are antibodies that went into clinical trials and then approval that were originally thought to be targeting antibodies. So I talked about daratumumab, which targets a molecule called CD38. There's another one called elotuzumab, which targets a molecule called SLAM-F7. Now, these molecules are expressed on the surface of myeloma cells. They're also expressed on a lot of other cells of the immune system. And interestingly, even though in the laboratory the evidence suggests that these antibodies stick to the myeloma cells and they bring in NK cells and the NK cells can kill those tumor cells, that definitely does happen, but there's other things that happen too. For example, daratumumab, which is now FDA approved for myeloma, it appears to activate T cells. So there's something about that interaction with CD38 under normal circumstances and then with the abnormal expression on myeloma cells that inhibits the immune system, and that adding in this antibody reactivates it. And it's distinct from the action of checkpoint inhibitors, for example. And then elotuzumab, which is also approved, the target SLAM-F7 is also expressed on NK cells. And if you activate NK cells in a laboratory by adding elotuzumab, those NK cells can go and kill myeloma cells even if they haven't been coated with the elotuzumab. So there's secondary effects of these antibodies which are clearly improving the immune response. So now we're combining those antibodies with checkpoint inhibitors. So there's clinical trials combining both elotuzumab and daratumumab with immune checkpoint inhibitors and with other drugs that enhance immunity. So that's hitting different spots on that cycle, as we discussed.
So when do patients actually decide whether to go on these exciting combination clinical trials for myeloma? So obviously there's approved treatments. You already talked about, stem cell transplants. So where does these new immunotherapy combination clinical trials fall into the spectrum of deciding when do you go that route?
So the myeloma field, it's the best of times and the worst of times. So we have a number of new options for myeloma patients. So unlike 15 years ago when I started in this field where conventional chemotherapy was the only answer, we have targeted therapies, we have immunologic therapies, we have conventional chemotherapies that are better tolerated and better formulated. The upfront treatment for myeloma is pretty well defined right now. And for the most part, historically, clinical trials were brought in at the very late stages, patients who had failed standard chemotherapy. We're trying to move clinical trials earlier to, for example, first or second relapse, to try to gain traction and longer remissions and better leveraging of a healthier immune system for these immune therapy trials. So we're doing immune therapy trials in transplant. We're doing immune therapy trials in the so-called early relapse, so it's first or second relapse. The decision to go on to a clinical trial when there's so many other options available, it can be challenging, but fortunately, most of the clinical trials will not close off those standard options in the future. So for example, if you participate in a clinical trial in your first or second relapse, there's a half dozen FDA-approved therapies that are available for you if you should progress on that after that clinical trial. And it's important to do that because the best of times we have all these new therapies, the worst of times, unfortunately today in 2016, we still don't have broadly applicable curative therapy for myeloma. So the search goes on, right. And so we're trying to move those trials earlier and earlier in the disease.
So that kind of kind of moves me into another question, and I'm going to give this one to you, Jedd.
Okay.
I don't know how much the patients in the audience have heard, but some of the checkpoint blockades, most of them have been approved for advanced melanoma or advanced diseases in different states, advanced non-small cell lung cancer. Recently, I know the news picked up a big deal that they tried to move some of these checkpoints into earlier as first-line treatment for these types of lung cancer, and the trial did not meet its primary endpoint. Now, this got a lot of press, and I think these are the types of things that patients look at and read, and I guess I want to get your opinion here about, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. What does this mean? How do you put this in perspective when sometimes there's, I think, a little bit over media hype of things? And so I'd love you to respond to that.
Okay. I think it's an important point, actually, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about it. So the trial that you're referring to was a trial using one of the two PD-1 blocking medicines called nivolumab. And as I mentioned earlier, there are two medicines that block the PD-1 receptor. One of them is called nivolumab. The other one is called pembrolizumab. My compliance office doesn't let me say the trade names, so sorry about that. In any case, they both have activity in lung cancer. They both have activity in melanoma. They both have activity in Hodgkin's disease. They both have activity in a long list of cancers, thankfully. A clinical trial was conducted in patients who had never received treatment for lung cancer before, with no strict requirement for a high level of that biomarker PD-L1 on the surface of the lung cancer cells using nivolumab, where patients were either assigned to receive nivolumab or chemotherapy. Now, even though chemotherapy has been around for a while and some people consider it to be sort of yesterday's therapy, it still can work. And it actually improved the lifespan of people with lung cancer before anything else did. So this was not a trial of nivolumab against placebo. It was a trial of nivolumab against chemotherapy, which we know had activity. And the question being asked was, in a relatively unselected population of lung cancer patients, did nivolumab do better than chemotherapy? And the answer was no. Now, that had a real ripple effect through the media, the financial community. I'm not going there because right? But it was especially important because there's another medicine that looks really similar called pembrolizumab, which had a positive trial. But the problem was, when you try to compare these two things, the trials were designed differently. The pembrolizumab trial required that a patient's tumor have a very high level of that PD-L1 protein on it, whereas the other trial didn't. So you had a very enriched population of patients that were selected because we kind of knew that they were at a high likelihood of responding. And so when you ask the question, you're more likely to get a positive answer. So this was not an opportunity to say one drug works and the other one doesn't. That is the wrong conclusion, right? The right conclusion is to say that these questions were asked differently, and we have to be really careful about what we read and how we interpret it.
Thank you.
Good?
Very good. That was a very good answer. So we know that there's an awful lot of clinical trials out there, an awful lot of immunotherapy clinical trials, very different than it was 5 years ago. And so I'm going to throw this out to everybody so anyone can answer this. How do you actually, from a patient's perspective, go about picking what it would be the best clinical trial for you? Are there tips? I know this is a big question, and
I'll start, and then you guys can add in. I think, this comes back very critically to the points that Stephen Estrada made very elegantly, where it does help for you as the coach of your team, as he put it, to do a little homework and to get a little information of what is out there. Clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource. It's a website that lists clinical trials. You can pull it up and just put in a cancer diagnosis and see the different types. You can put the cancer type plus immunotherapy or vaccine, and it'll sort them out by that type of treatment. the information there is somewhat technical, but at least it's a starting point of what information is out there that may suit you. And then there are other resources like the CRI website and their ability to help patients try to navigate different support groups out there for different cancer indications. Also, I think are gaining more and more information to help guide patients and families through these somewhat overwhelming situations and decisions. So I think first and foremost, do a little homework and find out important information that you can then bring back to your quarterback, your oncologist to talk further about. When I have patients where there's multiple different clinical trial options, this is definitely a field that is increasingly becoming apparent, as Dr. Wolchok put it, where one size does not fit all. And we're learning a tremendous amount, but we still have a tremendous amount to learn ahead of us about what may guide the choices that will be relevant for a given individual. The genetic testing that's out there can be helpful. The analysis of tumor material, the technology now is at a state that's we've never had to be able to exploit and to use on a day-to-day basis for our patients. So we have more and more tools. We're trying to catch up with the technology and be able to use those tools effectively to help guide our patients. But that's what I do when I sit down with a given individual and their family, is look at their case very in a very detailed way and try to figure out of the options that are out there, what are the factors in their case that may make option A the best choice versus B versus C. And then the other strategy, I think it's important, and I think it's been alluded to by some of the questions that have come up, is by thinking about these trials, is there an approach that doesn't necessarily burn bridges, that keeps options open for you if one thing doesn't work? Are there other things that could fall into place behind that? So that's also a way, particularly when trials, we don't have any data, we don't know the answers yet, so we can't tell you we know this is the right choice because we know it's helping and working, it's just too early. But if we know there are a variety of different options, to kind of maybe pick one or think about one, prioritizing one that doesn't burn bridges and leaves other options open, so that if we see that's not working, we can move on to plan B pretty quickly.
I think those are really good points. I just want to add a little bit to that last item, because this is a question that is really often asked when we are talking about clinical trials with patients, that they are, and their family members, wondering, well, what bridges might this burn or not in the future? And so while it's important to consider that, I think there's no way for us to know what trials 2 or 3 years from now will look like. So I think if you're kind of stuck at that point, you know, it's just good to remember that what matters is to make the best decision for what's available right now. It's good to be thoughtful, but there's so much that we don't know in terms of what trials will look like in a few years, what eligibility will look like, what what clinical trials may or may not prohibit treatment X or Y that you might have received in the past. So while that's important, I wouldn't necessarily hold up your decision making based on that.
So I want to emphasize what I consider to be the most important point. If you're a cancer patient and you're thinking about going on a clinical trial, the decision is yours. You have to make the decision for what's best for you, what fits your needs, your desires, what's going to address your specific concerns about your disease. So whether that's standard therapy or a clinical trial or a choice among clinical trials, it's your decision. So I encourage you to educate yourself. If your particular physician doesn't offer clinical trials or doesn't have access to them, I would encourage you to seek a disease-specific specialist who can offer you clinical trial options, and make the decision that's right for you.
Well, thank you for that. So where do you think is the best place for patients to find out about, the primer on what's happening in research? I mean, is it to follow things like the ASCO meetings, which is the American Society of Clinical Oncology, which happens every June, where there's always kind of breakthrough reports out of all of the later stage clinical trials of how treatment is changing, or where do you think patients should go if they really want to become students of what's happening and stay on top of new outcomes and things? Any suggestions for that, or is it the New York Times?
So I think that the information that you get can be overwhelming. So things that are reported in popular media, like in the Science Times or whatever about clinical trials, can sometimes miss the point for you. It'll say drug company A stock takes a big hit because their clinical trial fails, because that's what's important to the news, but that doesn't help you. And I find, so in my field, in multiple myeloma, there's two excellent patient advocacy groups. One's called the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, the other one's called the International Myeloma Foundation. And there's similar groups for the vast majority of cancers. And I think that if you seek out these advocacy groups, they're really good sources of primary information. So they'll go to the meetings, they'll follow the publications, and they'll distill that down into information that is useful to you as a patient and to your caregivers and partners as support, so that they can strip away a lot of the technical detail and boil it down to its essence. So they have people like me or Jedd or Dave who help advise them in reporting clinical and scientific information, but it's digestible in a form for you. And you can go from there if you want, or if you're able to go to primary sources. You can read the papers, read the manuscripts, read the textbooks, but those are great places to start. And they often will have ways for you to access what clinical trials are available in your area, in your disease, what's the latest thing, et cetera. So I think patient advocacy groups are great sources.
Great. Thank you. And I'm going to put a plug in for the Cancer Research Institute. I think this went off again. That one's on. If you're just interested in immunotherapy trials, obviously CRI is not specific to any given type of cancer, but if you're interested in immunotherapy, if you go to our website, you can find by cancer type what's actually available in immunotherapies in terms of what's already been approved or what are the current clinical trials. And so that's another source if you're only immunotherapy interested. So you want to say something?
Yeah. I also think that something that Stephen had mentioned this morning is finding an oncologist who's an expert in the treatment of your particular disease is really important. They and their team are your best sources of information, because you can get face-to-face information from them, and you can ask pointed questions about what are the specific treatments available to me for this disease. So, obviously we represent 3 highly prestigious academic cancer centers, and so but there are many places, and so I would say that seeking out the best oncology team to treat you is in fact the most important way to get information. And then, if you want to supplement that information at home and enrich, I think that some of the patient advocacy organizations are great sources, as of course the CRI, with events like today.
So I think it's going to be about time to open up questions from the audience. I will just say, as we're waiting to see who might want to ask, I hope it has come across today that immunotherapies is kind of a catch-all term. A lot of what we've heard about checkpoint blockades, these are the ones that have recently been approved and kind of changing the face of why immunotherapy is now becoming front and center. But there's other types. There's also been an oncolytic virus called TVAC that's been approved. We also have a lot of current research on CAR T cells, these chimeric antigen receptor T cells, mostly in the blood cancers, but also being investigated in solid tumors. So hopefully that came across, that immunotherapy doesn't mean the same thing all the time. There's a lot of different types of immunotherapies. Different immunotherapies work for different cancer types. So just so you're aware, I hope that's come across. So now I'm just going to open up to any questions out there. Now you're going to have to take this back. Now this is going to be interesting.
Oh, this is on now. So we have one that works up here. Okay, good. Now see who they're going to ask this to.
Hi, thanks for all the information. So my question is regarding, since you brought up the targeted therapies for lung cancer, EGFR, ALK-ROS1, we've heard that patients whose tumor cells are not highly mutated are often not as receptive to immunotherapies. What's been your experience in using immunotherapy for patients who do have mutations in EGFR, ALK-ROS1?
Take that. That's a really important question. The data that Dr. Cho alluded to, was about not necessarily the cancer genes, the ones that are causing the cancer being mutated, but more that the whole cancer genome is more heavily abnormal than the normal lung tissue counterpart. And we believe that the tumors that are showing themselves to be most responsive to immunotherapy, the checkpoint blockade immunotherapies, are those that have just a greater number of mutations, not necessarily in the genes like ROS or ALK or EGFR that are responsible for driving the cancer cell's proliferation. And we think that it's in fact because of external carcinogens like tobacco smoke, like sunlight, or in the case of melanoma, that cause a lot of genetic damage in the tumor, that those tumors are more likely to respond to immunotherapy. Now, Stephen spoke very, very much on point about tumors that just of their own volition have a large number of mutations because the autocorrect mechanism that usually is responsible for making sure that our genomes are perfect when they copy themselves, when those autocorrect mechanisms go wrong, you can have these kinds of cancers that occur in Lynch syndrome, which have thousands of mutations in them. Not necessarily, though, in a cancer gene. So we have seen, say in melanoma and in lung cancer, that patients who have a BRAF mutation in melanoma are really not more or less likely to respond to immunotherapy than patients who don't have a BRAF mutation. I think that in lung cancer it's a little bit more complicated because the tumors that have, say, an EGFR mutation tend to occur in folks who haven't had a lot of tobacco exposure. And so therefore the cancer genome in those folks is less mutated. So there may be an association there, but it's not absolute.
Okay, I don't. Who has the microphone?
Oh, we do.
Where's the other mic? What happened to the other microphone?
She has it right there.
Oh, sorry.
Well,
Oh, okay.
we're going to get that back.
We're going to get that one back.
Hello. Thank you all for a very, very intensively wonderful, mind-opening sessions. But I want to come down a notch or two because I want to know, and I've asked many people who work with cancer patients, the food issue. You are what you eat. I never get an answer from a doctor who says, is there a whole big thing that we should all follow, organic food or vegetarian? Or is it all right to throw in a Yankee ballpark hot dog? These are things that I'm going to ask you, and you can decline not to answer. What is it you eat?
Okay, that's fair.
And the other thing is also,
That's
I
fair.
hope you won't decline this, but it is a very big issue.
Yeah.
And we have no way of looking at it.
I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole.
I'm brave. So first of all, thank you for asking that, because I get asked that almost every time I see a new consultation. And the answer is there isn't one thing that you should or shouldn't eat. And so, I have a fellow right now, an oncologist in training working with me, who said basically, it's really simple things. Eat less, eat fresh food, right, and eat more plants. So it's really about moderation. It's not about cutting out necessarily all sugar. It's not about being macrobiotic, unless you like that, right? I think it's really about moderation and just general health. And if you want some guidance about what's a healthy diet, the American Heart Association has done some wonderful work on what a healthy diet is. I understand why people are interested in the diet question because it is something that's under everyone's control. But unfortunately, it's not a simple answer. And I'll just close the question with one anecdote from a patient who raised the next most common question, which is, what can I buy that will make my immune system work better, right? And so this question was asked to me by a very prominent patient advocate with melanoma who said, you tell me I'm not eligible for this trial or that trial, and you're interested in immunotherapy. What can I buy that will make my immune system work better? And so I said off the top of my head without thinking, well, I'm sure if you go down the road to GNC, they'll be able to sell you a couple $100 worth of stuff that they tell you will boost your immune system, but there really isn't much hard scientific evidence that that enhances your immune response to cancer. And this patient sits there and she kind of strokes her chin a little bit. She goes, you do know that my husband and I own that company, do you? So that was the last time I spoke about that.
Good. I think we have another question over here with the microphone.
Hi. My brother was just diagnosed with stage 4 rectal cancer. I went to his lung. He's only 43, so that's why I'm here today. So my question is, I have no medical background at all. I'm really just here to try to get as much information for him as I can. Sorry. How do we know what clinical trials or immunotherapy he can be eligible for? Is it through his doctors? We've registered him with Stand Up to Cancer. I'm sorry.
So,
yeah.
do you want to tell me? What did you say about the?
My question is, it's very overwhelming and confusing. He was told, he's at Fox Chase now, he was told at Sloan that he was not eligible for any immunotherapies, but they didn't do any blood work at that time, as far as I know, because there's some blood work that has to come back as far as biomarkers. So my question is, as someone that's helping him, I'm here to help. So what else can I do to make sure that he's part of or enrolled in immunotherapy clinical trials? Is this something we do, or we have to wait for his doctors to tell him he's eligible for?
I'll give some answer there, but others may want to comment as well. I think the clinical trials can be frustrating because they have very strict, what we refer to as eligibility criteria. These are criteria that define which patients are allowed to participate, and they're usually very strict because we want to have as homogeneous a patient population as possible in order to answer a very critical question. And once that question is answered, move on to the next one with another trial that's looking at a very important aspect, and step by step get something to the point where it'll be helpful and successful. So it is very frustrating when patients aren't eligible because the trial has this factor or that factor. There are many trials out there, and I think it comes back to this theme again that Stephen and others here have echoed, of doing a little homework and looking to see. Now, Memorial Sloan Kettering may not have trials for his situation. There may be others, and his doctor, your homework, kind of putting that information together. The CRI can help, and patient support groups have access to various clinical trials that are ongoing with specific cancers. All of those resources are growing. There's still deficiencies, but they're at least growing.
Just say about the
Navigator.
And
yeah.
for the if you're specifically interested in immunotherapy trials, we have a service here today. Frederick, raise your hand in the back there. See Frederick on our staff back there. We'll take you outside. We actually have patient navigators here. So Okay, good. So that's a way to at least match up, knowing the specific case of a patient, what trials would potentially be eligible, and then you really need to take that to the physician and talk about and see getting on. But at least it's a first step of narrowing it down, because I know if you go on by yourself, you might get hundreds of trials that look right, and you don't know enough to know if this is right for him or not. So it helps to have a patient navigator get you through and at least give you potential things that you are eligible for, and then follow it up.
Yeah, that's a great service that's available here. I also think it's important that your brother is being taken care of, at a major comprehensive cancer center, and that he is taken care of by someone who focuses on colorectal cancer. And so that person, he or she will know what trials are the most important ones in the field and when is the right moment to offer a clinical trial. You don't have to do the work if you don't want to. All you have to remember is that you just ask that oncologist, what about clinical trials? A couple of years ago, I think it was the AACR gave out a button for all of us to wear that said, ask me about clinical trials. Because it is an area that we just need to raise awareness of.
I think we're going to
cut off. All right, yeah. Thank you very much. Panelists, I wish we had some more time for these excellent questions. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists.